Hi and welcome to the Neil Ashton podcast. In each episode, we explain some of the fascinating ways that science and engineering are changing the world around us. We talk to leading engineers from elite level sports like cycling and Formula One, to some of the world's top academics to understand how fluid dynamics, machine learning, supercomputing are bringing in a new era of discovery. We also hear some of their life stories, their career advice, and lessons they've learned on the way that I hope will be helpful to you too. So sit back and enjoy this episode. Hi and welcome back to the Neil Ashton podcast. So my guest today is Professor Nathan Kutz, a true pioneer at the intersection of machine learning, dynamical systems, and fluid mechanics. He's really been one of the household names in this field and has been part of many of the key sort of advances, and now actually has moved on to playing a key role at one of the major companies in this space at Autodesk Research. He started his journey at University of Washington, so he earned a degree in physics and maths there in 1990, and then did a PhD at Northwestern University. He returned back to University of Washington and was the chair of the Applied Mathematics Department, and was also co-directing the AI Institute in Dynamic Systems. He's probably best known for his work on the dynamic mode decomposition and DMD, and also was a co-author with, at his time, one of his postdocs, Stephen Brunton, on the SINDy, a sparse identification of nonlinear dynamics, which really was part of the breakthrough and the push in the mid-2010s, 2016, well before machine learning for science and engineering was such a household thing and such a key area. So that arguably they worked on it whilst it was still not clear how important this space would be, and the work that they did really has proved to be a landmark paper. They also wrote a textbook, Data-Driven Science and Engineering, and that was between Steve Brunton and Nathan. But and of course, many other papers which we'll link to in the show notes that really has been influential in this field. One of the reasons why he's so interesting is that isn't just a sort of academic. He actually spent time at sabbatical working alongside Formula One with the McLaren team, and we talk in this episode about how that was really influential for his thinking and trying to tackle the more industrial problems, and that ultimately led to him moving over and becoming the director of physics-informed AI at Autodesk Research. And I found this conversation fascinating because we sort of went back and forth a little bit on some of the history and the differences between reduced order modeling and machine learning, and then pivoted a lot to this question of can we just spend billions of dollars on data and we'll all be good and we have some foundation model, or do we really need to have some physics in there to make this more affordable and achievable and interpretable? We also pivoted and talked quite a lot on the agents front and how we see those as being key to distilling knowledge from what is very expert-driven processes. We were saying that it's not good enough just to have the access to a highly efficient code to generate data or a great machine learning architecture. You need the human knowledge, the processes that often these companies had. And we said that distilling this into agents for those companies could really help them to move faster. And we finished off looking more broadly at where the world's going with this sort of technology. One of the standout things that he said, and I fully agree with him, is in this age, the need to think big is more important than ever. Things are moving so fast that actually having that mindset of really challenging your own thinking is important. And then the final topic was really more career advice to new people in this space and how they should deal with this changing world of AI and what they should be studying going forward. As with all these episodes, I think we could have carried on for many hours, and I hope I'll have an opportunity to do that again with Nathan and speak back to him in a few years and see if some of the predictions were correct. But I certainly learned a lot from this conversation, and I hope that you do too. So sit back and listen to this conversation with Professor Nathan Kutz. Well, thank you, Nathan, for coming on this. This has been on my sort of wish list to speak to you. Every time I talk about machine learning related to engineering, to CFD, to any of these problems, your name is very high up the list, some seminal pieces of work. And arguably you've been working on this way before this was a sort of buzzword topic, a sort of sexy area to get into. Where did you sort of start to get into this? What was your career trajectory, and when did you see this as like the missing piece to start using some of these machine learning or reduced order techniques?
Yeah. So thanks for having me, first of all, Neil, to be here. I'm excited to talk to you as well. And I would say that I suppose I got into it just out of pure interest in sort of a very accidental way. I was working when I started as a faculty, late 90s. It's a while ago now. And that was the beginning of my career. I was working a lot in atomic and optical physics. So I was doing theory for mode block lasers, lots of computation, lots of modeling, integration of those two together, trying to work with experimentalists. And I really enjoyed that. But around the mid 2000s, what I found was I couldn't get students interested in this stuff. Like a lot of the students just did not want to work on these, let's call them harder physics problems, right? Where you had to know some quantum and E&M. They were very interested at the time in neuroscience. Like that was the hot applied math field that everybody wanted to do. And so around 2007, 6 and 7, I decided, look, having a hard time getting students. I really like the work, but there's so many new interesting areas. And I also had a little bit of, I guess, I would just say it's an academic crisis. I think everybody goes through it a little bit where you kind of get a little bored with what you're doing. You see that, yes, I could continue this for a long time in my career, or I take the risk and do something really new. And of course, this is a little scary when you're more of a senior person because, like you're like a beginner again. I remember going to this neuroscience workshop where clearly every grad student in the room knew more than me about neuroscience, but I was this odd duck, which like, well, he seems to know something. Like he's not just an illiterate science person, but on the other hand, doesn't seem to know much neuroscience. And then, to put yourself in that, I would say, a very vulnerable position was kind of what I did. And I started actually in about 2006, 7 to do neuroscience. And then also at that time, seeing some of the data, I thought, hey, there's these data analysis methods. What if I started integrating that into sort of building models? And so that was really the initial part of that. I would say I got into sort of, let's call it broadly, maybe you wouldn't call it that now. It's actually the language around what machine learning is and deep learning, it's almost all deep learning now. Let's call, if you go back 2007 and 8, it wasn't neural networks yet. But I started using a lot of these methodologies that came out of the data-driven piece. And really part of the incentive there was I saw that there was this great opportunity in neuroscience where we didn't have first principle models, right? Where you didn't have F equals ma. You didn't have a Maxwell's equations. You had data and neurons and people were making up models, but you were also looking at trying to build models at, population levels of neurons. And I just started building these data-driven models back in that time frame, 2008, 7, 8. And I thought it was awesome. I just really enjoyed the new direction. And then I kind of just pivoted over to there and started working in data-driven modeling. I started to teach a class on it at the University of Washington. It was 2008. So it was very early on. And mostly I just did it because I liked it. I didn't see what was coming in 10 years, right? I mean, it's money, you can always bracket, I saw it way ahead of it. But I mean, really, I just did it because I was interested and I thought it was very powerful. And I remember going to some of these optics conferences because I started doing this and I'm like, wait a minute, we can actually start doing some of this to model lasers. And I'd show up at these optics conferences, and they're like, "What is this stuff you're doing?" Right? It was like when you're talking about machine learning integration into the modeling pipeline. At that point, it was so foreign to people. It was like this, this guy's lost his marbles. He does really fallen off the wagon in terms of he's way out there. And then, you advance a decade and then everybody is using it, right? Uh, yeah, I'd love to say I saw that, but I just did it because I liked it. And it turned out to be something that everybody started doing. So that was actually my journey into it. And then I just built from there. And now I'm just in fear of getting left behind because, like, these days what they could do with, is unbelievable. Like, they work so much faster than I ever did in my whole career. Oh, yeah.
Oh, that's funny. So how did you, obviously it looked like 2016, 17 was like quite a big time, obviously with Steve as well. Like, how did the years come up to that sort of seminal piece of work?
Yeah. So, the academic year starting 2012, I had brought on Steve as my postdoc. He was at Princeton finishing up, and I was very fortunate to get somebody of that quality. Partly it was there was a two-body problem, so I jointly hired Bing, his wife, with Tom Daniel over in biology, and myself, as I didn't have enough money for two postdocs. I had money for one and a half, so I put half for Bing and got Tom to do another half, and then hired Steve on. And at that time, I was already doing some of the data-driven modeling, especially things like dynamic mode decomposition. I had started working on already in 2012, 2013. And so already was this regression framework towards thinking about dynamical systems. And then it just turned out that it was just the perfect timing with Steve and with an amazing group of graduate students and postdocs, and also a little bit more open space. Back then it wasn't nowadays it's almost like there's just so many people working in this area that it's hard to gain any room. But back then it was still pretty early on in the sciences. We have ImageNet, right, 2014, that hadn't quite made its transition over to the sciences. I think that would be more like 2018, 19, 20, like where they were really getting into it. So we were early on, had some free space there, and also had less rules, I guess. And we just started doing some stuff there. And I think obviously SINDy came out of that time period, and some PD finders, the dynamic mode decomposition and then tying all that together with what was happening also in reduced order modeling. So it just was a really fantastic time. And then Steve then took a faculty position there in mechanical engineering. And then we continued to have a really great partnership with our students and postdocs. And it was incredibly productive in terms of starting to build, these data-driven models and trying to bring in machine learning overall into the standard dynamical systems framework.
So maybe for people who are not so familiar, how would you describe SINDy and the sort of POD methods? What was the core aim or thing that you were trying to solve through them?
Yeah. So I think there's two different aspects here. So I always think about physics as sort of if you go back to like every engineer, they got sort of a classic, except for computer scientists, if you want to consider them engineers. They're a little different brand of engineer, but almost every other engineer had to take statics and dynamics. And in statics and dynamics, there was only one thing you really did, which is you drew a free body diagram. And then once you drew the right free body diagram, that was really almost every homework set was just draw the right free body diagram. Because once you draw the right free body diagram, you could actually either sum of forces equals 0, that's statics, sum of forces equals not 0, dynamics. But if you didn't draw the right free body diagram, it was going to be a really hard solve.
Yeah.
And the way I think about that in context of what we were trying to do, like even with POD or these, even what we do now with encoders is can I find the right representation or the right coordinate system in which to express my dynamics? And so that was already sort of a philosophical idea of like, hey, we have all this data, it's high dimensional, it looks crazy, but at the end of the day, that we can find some kind of embedding where it actually looks kind of simple, maybe, right? But then what's happening in that space is now you have to have some kind of dynamical system relationships. And so the SINDy part really comes from this idea that if we look at our physics models, all the physics models that we have are really essentially expressions of relationships among derivatives, time and space, right? And it's a most remarkable compression of knowledge that I think we have ever developed as humans, right? You write down Maxwell's equations. You have this, you can fit it on the t-shirt, right? You could order online on Amazon this afternoon and get it, right? And you have those Maxwell's equations on your t-shirt. And what's amazing about it is it models, all of our Wi-Fi signals, like coming, radar, radio waves. The diversity of what you're modeling in this compact representation, which is astounding. Same thing with how we are able to get, when we think about quantum mechanics, it's like, three terms, right? You have your dispersion term, your potential, and your time derivative. And it's, so I think the motivation for SINDy was this idea that we've had tremendous success in history with these compact representations of relationships among derivatives. And so the SINDy algorithm goes directly after that. It says, well, there's lots of derivatives and derivative relationships. When you look at this data, how few of these derivative relationships can you use that actually fit the data? And that's where this idea of having a library of potential candidates and then sparsely regress to just a few terms came out of. And it's kind of a philosophical thing. So I think like physicists like this idea. It's not clear that computer scientists like this idea. Like computer scientists I've heard this directly. They feel like, well, that's your 20th century crutch of physics. Like that's because that's what let's let the computer figure out
that is the
whatever
debate.
it wants, right?
Yeah.
So it's still a tension point. But as we talk further about some of where physics AI is going, I think one of the things that's really incredibly valuable to consider is that governing equations so far, I think this is true. I mean, it's hard to, these are statements and of opinions, I guess, but really historically we can see that they've been the most incredible engines of extrapolation. Making predictions where I've never had data about something that might happen. If I go over there in parameter space, my model predicts like this bifurcation, like the change of the system. And then you can start doing an experiment over there and validate that, right? Whereas machine learning, it's very difficult to predict outside of, if you don't have data there, like you're just not going to get it, right? So governing equations still, at least in my heart, hold massive value because of this extrapolation capability that I think are going to still need in the future.
Yeah, that's a very good transition point, I guess. Well, first of all, I'd be interested in how you would describe, before we get on to maybe today's debate on machine learning methods and surrogates and, the influence of physics versus data-driven. Some more skeptics, will sort of say, this whole fuzz now about machine learning, it's just basically reduced order modeling. We've been doing it, for ages. How would you define the differences and the similarities between sort of those earlier reduced order modeling sort of techniques and today with the more sort of transformer-based neural networks, what we would call sort of machine learning in a very broad term?
Yeah. So early days of reduced order modeling, I think there was still this idea that these POD modes, you do the SVD, you have these structures that come out. I think it still allowed for some flexibility in the idea of interpretation, right? So you would have things that were coming out that you would argue made sense. Like, so for instance, even POD modes of flow around the cylinder, you look at it and go like, I can explain what that is. And there was something very comforting about that, like to have sort of in some sense a basis. And so I think for us, if you look at the 20th century applied math literature and what the impact was, we did a lot of expansions and bases. Fourier transform was a workhorse. We could say, look, in signal processing, right? Like just do a Fourier transform, process everything in the signal domain, come back. And we had this idea of interpretability built in because we kind of knew what cosines and sines were. We followed that up even with wavelets. And even special functions, which were sort of like in mathematical physics, the foundation of the 1950s and 60s for doing analysis of systems. It was this idea that there is a basis functions. In other words, I would call this a nice coordinate system that's sort of interpretable to you. So you can project everything into this, do your work in there. You feel comfortable with it because it's, you interpret it. And then you can come back and do your analysis. And by the way, we're very successful with this, right? And largely we constrained ourselves in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, even up to the 80s, to linear problems. Because then we could use superposition. We could have solutions which were linear combinations of these things. And then I think at the end of the 80s, of course, in the early 90s, we had the first computational revolution, which was, I could just throw that PD on the computer and discretize and start simulating. And so I feel like when I went to grad school, I was in grad school in 1990 to 94. And I feel like I was the first generation where there was an expectation you're going to simulate PDs and ODs in your thesis somewhere. At that point, we had now, desktop computers in the lab. So it wasn't like there's some central computer, a DEC machine somewhere in a core, that you run jobs on. This is now like, it's just sitting here in the office and you're interacting and programming with it. And so for the first time, we are actually starting able to solve nonlinear PDEs because we could just numerically simulate them. And of course, it's very interesting because I think the faculty back then were like, these kids, they don't know what they're doing. They don't understand physics, yet they're doing, they're claiming all this stuff. And of course, it's sort of true, right? Because they were used to solving things, really understanding the problem at some fundamental level, and especially doing lots of asymptotic reductions into corners of parameter space where you could linearize and say quite a bit, right? That's almost the whole fluid mechanics mantra. It's like, look over here. We have JFM to tell us what's going over there right? But then we had that simulation capability, and then we started saying, okay, but so we still had some interpretation, like I'm expanding in Fourier basis, or I'm doing finite differences, finite elements. And then from there, from those simulations, then we started a new basis, which was the POD, right? Which is like, let's just build a basis directly from the SVD. So we still felt it was very morally equivalent to what we were kind of doing before. And then the transformation now is sometimes it's just really hard to get your head around what happened in this thing. Like I transformer, and then I have an attention layer, and I got this decoder that's then being modulated. I mean, right? We could see some of the sophistication in some of the structures are kind of simple, but more and more they're becoming fairly complex, and it's really hard for us to decipher what's happening there. But you can't argue often with how well it works, right? You get the results, and you're going like, yeah, but I can't beat this. So I have to, I want to use it. And by the way, I started to appreciate computer scientists quite a bit now, because at first, I was like that old grumpy professor, which is like these computer science kids, they don't know any physics. They just go do stuff, and they get a score, and they got a cross-validation score, and they move on with their lives, right? The flip side now is I have grown to absolutely love fearlessness of a computer science grad student. They just like try stuff.
Yeah.
I'm not encumbered by all this physics knowledge. Like, if I look at this typical physics student or engineering or applied math, they kind of are, they're prejudiced by what they learned. So they're like,
Yes.
they would try to make smart things, structures. Whereas the computer scientists are just like, just try stuff. What if we did this? What if we did this? And that fearlessness has led them to unbelievable results. And I think it's going to be left to the applied mathematicians and engineers and the theory people to kind of pick up the pieces to try to understand, okay, but in here, we now got to dissect this to see what you actually learned here, because somehow it is working. I'm going to give you credit for that, but I'd really love to understand what this thing's actually learning about the physics, right? And I think that's kind of one of the big next steps that's going to happen in the community.
So you'd say almost and I've heard similar things, the interpretability is the key bit. Like, how does this work? Why does it work? What is it that is the knob that has changed? That, how do you do? And I guess, like you say, it's all good when it works.
Yeah.
But when it doesn't work, it's like, well, why didn't it work?
Yeah.
Is the question.
Yeah. And at least in our standard physics modeling, right, we always had some recourse to, like, there was just a few parameters. We could actually diagnose why it broke or it went through a bifurcation, or there was a transition. Like, we had a way of understanding what might happen. Where in these things, it's a little bit like, I don't know what kind of car you drive, but like when something breaks there, you just automatically have to go to a mechanic because the cars are so complex now that you have to have specialists fix it. Where, I think, when I was a kid, I think there was a lot of people that fixed their own cars, right? It was a little bit more interpretable what was happening in that engine. But now it's like, no, everything's run off a bunch of electronic components with all these different pieces. And I think of it like that. And when they break, you just have no idea. And instead of fixing it, maybe you just train another neural network with a different structure that doesn't break there.
Yeah. I mean, how do you see then today? Because that does seem to be the challenge of our time, doesn't it? That you are, I mean, I guess out of distribution versus in distribution. If you train on a bunch of cars, is it just the case that is essentially not unsolvable, but a problem that can only really be addressed just by having more data that makes that out of distribution in distribution? And so the solution is just keep building bigger and bigger models with more and more data. Or do you feel that is essentially inefficient and not a scalable method, and therefore you need some ability to, as you say, use some modeling knowledge or physics knowledge to be able to model past the data?
Yeah. So this question is hard to answer for one reason, which is not scientific at all, which is just money. When you look at this Project Prometheus, for instance, that Bezos is involved with, and you look at their, $6.2 billion. Now, at some point you ask questions like, it's okay. Even now being at Autodesk. So first of all, if I go back to when I was a faculty, the ability to get data, like really say, we need to collect this data. It's like, oh wait, you're gonna have to write some massive grants. There's probably almost no way you're gonna get the kind of grant levels you need to collect the data you would need. So you're already constrained to saying, I've got to outsmart this and got to figure out how to do this. Now you move to a company. And now I'm at Autodesk. But even then, you're like, yeah, but it's not clear. There's a few companies. There's the $1 trillion companies, right? That potentially, if they desired to do so, could potentially set up the architecture to just collect the data, spend the billions to do things like this, and do that. Now that's a brute force approach, but I think the win is so big that they might just say, yeah, we could spend $10 billion because it's going to make us $1 trillion. Like very few places that can do it. Like, but even Project Prometheus might have the kind of cash resources, because my normal answer would be like, it is completely, I think, intractable to get the kind of data we need to do some of the science problems we need. But when you have 6.2 billion, right, and maybe more, right? I don't know. Like maybe you go like, we can do it. Like we're going to spend $3 billion to collect the data, right? That's the entire investment in the data is that money is to get the data, and then now we can build whatever the foundation model we need, or so that one, I think the jury's still out. So it goes right back to Richard Sutton's, right, the bitter lesson issue, which is so Sutton, I think, is right. If you have enough data, right, if you can collect enough data in an area, it's so far what we've seen. It's almost these machine learning, deep learning algorithms and structures are basically unbeatable. But the question is, can you really do this? I love also Max Welling wrote a response to this, which was, well, yeah, but a lot of times what we're trying to do scientifically is extrapolate. We're trying to build a new technology. So even if I collect all this data, the goal is to give me a great direction of like, actually, I think the future technology is over there. I have no data there. Now, maybe I could set up a pipeline. I have enough money to build the scaffolding for the data to collect on the way out there. But this is what I learned in my time at McLaren too, is the answer, the fast car is an extrapolation that's far away from where you're starting. Actually, far away is a little bit of an exaggeration. You're talking about tenths of seconds.
Yeah.
Right? Well, it feels far away when you're trying to like, the difference between winning the world title, like, which McLaren did while it was the time I was there, they were like, had the MCL 3839, which were world title winners. But, you're working at the margins of these updates that are trying to get you 0.2 of a second, 1/10 of a second, 0.3 of a second. But you're also going into a regime that there is no data. I have to actually get this data from simulations, do some wind tunnel to validate that it's there. So whether that's viable, they have $150 million a year budget. I don't know whatever the cap is. It's a little bit higher than that now. On that budget, there's no way you could do this, right? Just collect. There's money there to collect the data you would need. So it's a really interesting question. I think there's a group of people that fundamentally feel I will just spend so much money to collect the data so that I can make it just like language. But physics isn't language either. So there's still a bit here that we have to figure out. So my own personal belief is, or at least what I'm going to do, is embed physics type knowledge into these neural networks so we can do this much more efficiently. Anyway,
I've had this debate many times, and that was part of the reason for doing that paper with Johannes and Sid, was to try and project out some of this economies of things. But we still, I think, even writing that paper, we still got to the end, and I can't speak for the others, but at least for myself, we still didn't really resolve the fundamental challenge, which is, even with all the predictions we made, they weren't reaching the accuracy that was necessarily required, and some of that accuracy is very deep within the domain knowledge of those companies. And so a Formula One team would argue that they are the only ones who deeply know how to, set up a case and get it to give the right accuracy. If you just brute force, even take an LES model and try and run it, even with something like 1 billion cells, you could quite easily get it very wrong, very wrong. And even if you gave it 10 billion, doesn't actually, but you almost then have to extrapolate it all the way to the end, which is to do a complete DNS or something. But then what if you don't know the porosity values of the radiator that they're using? So there's, I kind of feel that in one sense, I agree with you that this does feel a little bit like just a data issue, and then, a bit like ChatGPT and others to show that, just put a lot of money behind something and you can solve it. But that, I guess the difference I would say, which is why I think I would agree more with your approach, is it makes sense when the opportunity of the market is trillions of dollars, which is basically enterprise AI.
Yeah.
But CFD, I don't think it's $1 trillion market. It's probably more in the tens of billions, maybe. So if you spend tens of millions, that makes you assume that you can take the entire market, which, so from a return on investment, that it's to me is a harder balance.
Well, and it's also interesting for some of these companies when you do science, and I think you hit on such a critical issue, which is this idea of tolerances. You're always going to have, I think, recourse to a physical manifestation of what you're doing, because okay, so think about world models a little bit, right? They're just fakes. They look cool. But people who build world models, no lives are dependent upon it. It's not like if I go in here, I could die. But if you have these people develop in a world model, I want you to design an airplane for me. There's no way I'm getting on that airplane. So there's sort of these zero failure environments where this idea of tolerance is absolutely king. And even I think Bezos is quite interested in this. Again, I'm just throwing out this project Prometheus because of just the staggering amount of money that's been invested in it, in the space. But he's interested in space travel and rockets, and you're like, okay, so those are zero failure environments. And when a prompt goes bad, like on ChatGPT or Gemini or Claude, nobody gets hurt, right? Really? I mean, at the end of the day, it's like, oh, it didn't quite get I didn't die because of it. But when you're going to do something like a rocket, right, where people's lives are at stake and you have to have the tolerances or else it's going to, that's where I think there's just such an amazing pressure, right, to get this right. And it's not clear to me how AI does that, right? It could be that agentic systems will learn how to do, I think we can certainly program, I think, agentic systems to say, now that I got most of the answer right, my agents are all about doing the tolerance checking and figuring out what experiments have to be run. Because in my view, I think really what happens is I think the agentic system should come back to you and say, hey, Neil, we need to do some experiments because right now I'm starting to hallucinate, or at least I'm uncertain about my models. And of course, they're not going to actually talk to you. They're going to actually talk to their robot friends and say, can you do this experiment?
Yeah.
The kind of result, I need you to do it under these kind of load conditions so they can, once I get that back, I can proceed along with my iteration. So I think that's going to be key for us somewhere along the way, right? But this tolerance idea is we still don't have a proof of, and it's not good enough just to have a world model that looks cool and looks right.
Yeah, that's I think that's fundamentally also, I guess, the practical challenge of this, where I feel probably individual companies will still play more of a role in this. If you're a large aircraft manufacturer, I would imagine that at least in the short to medium term, you're going to be the one that is most likely using some of your data to be fine-tuning this, or you'll be still doing. It's. I don't think you completely outsource this to a separate, entity. That feels. Although you raise an interesting point of experimental data, because I think that's probably often overlooked. That I guess the analogy, all the simulation is just synthetic data and it's not actually the ground truth.
Yeah.
Which is why I always struggle with initiatives to, if I train a machine learning model, we've had this debate. I'd be interested to know your thoughts. So if we take like a standard data set and the goal of the exercise is that your surrogate model should be able to predict the ground truth, and whoever gets it the closest gets the highest score and wins. But that has a certain ground truth baked into it because it was done with a RAND model and LES model. So if someone comes along who's trained this big foundation model and then they try and predict your case, they could actually have a worse score because their method was trained on the different underlying simulation data. But then which one's right? Because you've never actually said what's the ground truth, the real world truth,
Yeah. Well, actually, I think this is also one of the very difficult and fundamental challenges in science and engineering. We are right now using the ground truth as my simulation. Often, like when we test our methods, including us, it's like, how will this method work? Well, I'll pretend the truth is my simulator. The problem I see is that we say, okay, well, what if you had the experiment? Well, in experiments, we actually can never also have access to the ground truth because in an experiment, you have sensors, or either point sensors, or you're measuring some observables, but you never have the full state information like you do in the simulation. So this idea of a ground truth is really interesting because you never have it in real systems. You have some manifestations of measurements of that ground truth through your sensors. Your full state knowledge is only in a simulation world. And so how this connection of how do you assimilate those two together becomes now very important. And so somehow this, the whole data simulation effort, and we've seen the success of it in weather, right? So a lot of the companies have gotten into it because I think they benefited from basically the idea that like we've been collecting weather data for like decades upon decades, very well resolved. And so they can train these big models. And a lot of the people working in that space, like, look what we can do with machine learning. It's like, you understand you're in a very not representative scientific field. But for 40 years, 50 years, we've been collecting data ad nauseum in this space. And that's why your models work. Whereas in most other scientific fields, it's just not there. Or as you've pointed out, a lot of people guard their data closely. Like if you're a Formula One team, you don't share your simulation data. If you're a car company, you typically don't share your simulation data. People don't share their supply chain data. Like there's just so much data that is there, but nobody shares it. So we have that. It's kind of off limits a little bit.
Which is why I've often joked that probably the best company to make a foundation model for automotive is an automotive company. Frankly, if I was a car company, I'd be half tempted if I wasn't worried more about the car situation at the moment. I guess that's not their priority to build a foundation model, but that's the ironic thing. They've got all the expertise, all the data, all the knowledge, all the facilities, and they literally have it sat there. Wind tunnel probably running 24/7. All the stuff that a startup would dream of having. They actually have there. So it's on that. What about your time at McLaren then? What I guess you must be into cars to also want to do that. But what did it teach you going from being a faculty member to taking that time at McLaren? How did it shape your thinking?
Yeah. So first it was such a privilege to be there. I've been a Formula One fan since I was a little kid. So I'm half Brazilian. So in the 1970s, growing up a kid in Brazil, Emerson Fittipaldi was a Formula One champion. So every Brazilian loved Fittipaldi. But then I started watching it in high school. And the first Formula One race I watched was Ayrton Senna. And I was just some Sunday morning early, I started watching this race. It was on ESPN. And there was this young Brazilian kid. Ayrton Senna won that race. And I just became a super fan of Senna and course, then I loved McLaren because he was a 3-time champion with McLaren. And so I was a Formula One fan from the early days. And so I was on a sabbatical here in London, and I thought, what if I can connect up there? And the awesome thing is, Spencer Sherwin, who is at Imperial College in aerospace engineering, one of his former PhD students is head of CFD, Julian Hostler. So it's just he connected me, and then I was out there, and it taught me two things, two really big take-home messages that happened for me at McLaren that actually shaped part of why I even came to London to come to Autodesk. Number one, and this was really memorable, and it's almost sad to say a little bit, but they were a team. They worked together. They had a common objective. You could talk to anybody, from the person making coffee to the cafeteria people to head of engineering to the brand new engineer. Everybody knew and had a shared common goal, and were really working together to that common goal. And it's interesting coming from the academic environment, which is, yes, we're collaborative, but really we are ultra selfish in our structure, right? And I loved that. I loved being around these people who wanted to do great work, who had a shared vision. That doesn't mean people didn't have. I'm not saying that everything was, perfect, but that was felt to me so much healthier than what I'd been in for decades. So that really stuck with me, I have to say. It was a really, and just for my own self-reflection about like, oh, I didn't even realize how much of a world I live in of self-centeredness. So
that is the negative part of academia, isn't it? I mean, that sort of, I guess the best description I give, it feels like every professor is running their own startup or their own because it's very, like, people often call it something lab or some, it's, and I guess at worst, good luck being a head of department or a faculty head, because I guess it's like all rivals going after each other, challenging for funding. I guess in the best scenario, it's an amazing cross-collaborative environment of people. But I see what you mean. There's a certain...
Well, and I think I was very collaborative, and I was very friendly across and worked with lots of people, but it still was this very much like, I still have to get my grant. And I still have to take care of my students. And this was just kind of refreshing. But there was a second piece there. And the thing that I came there and I was like, oh, I've been doing reduced order models. I'm super excited about this, to do things. But really the big goal there was to update shape of the car. And then you just ask a very simple question. Here's a mesh, which is this car, which is, let's call it a billion parameter mesh. How do you do gradient descent updates on a billion dimensional mesh? And then I just saw that what you had there was a group of experts. And so it was human gradient descent, like true knowledge base of people who had long time experience understanding the flow physics off the front wing, the back wing, the underside, the side pods, who were making collectively a decision about like, what's the next upgrade of the shape that we try. And even understanding when they felt like we have to go to the wind tunnel with this design. The wind tunnel is very expensive. We get very limited time, but this recourse to reality that would sort of pin their designs down or actually invalidate them, right? It was really interesting to see this. And I felt, honestly, I guess I felt super like, I come in, I got this, tool set, and I felt powerless a little bit, which is, here's this inverse design problem, can't help with. And it really stuck with me afterwards. Like, how do I get into this geometry game and understand how to handle geometry in a much better way? And, how do I get a latent representation of geometry to do updates? And so, when Autodesk came along, I was like, wait a minute, this is probably one of the best geometry companies in the world. and do this design. And so it felt a very natural thing to come over because it was intellectually for me was one of the main things I wanted to go after.
Mm.
And I felt like if I try to do it in the academic environment, this pivot towards trying to generate all this skill set around geometry would take me a decade, right, to get like really there. Whereas coming to Autodesk was like, I immediately came into a group of colleagues who were, they, live and breathe this stuff. So it's like amazing. So those are the two things at McLaren and that really stuck out to me. And also maybe the third was just to walk into this McLaren Tech Center where
quite nice. Yeah.
Very nice. And also just to see, like, we rarely as academics also see that, by the time we write a paper, it's a year till it gets published. Like there's no, here on this factory floor, what all these engineers could see was, I've helped build this thing. And it's right there. It's like this physical manifestation of beauty. And it's like a gallery, an art gallery, right? You're like, oh my gosh, this is the... And even to see Senna's car, his MP44 from when I think his first championship, it's like, it's so motivating, right? To have that creative inspiration that's there. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's, I find that was my experience coming into Formula One, and I've seen almost exactly the same thing. And I think almost every startup that comes in trying to sell into an F1 team faces the same reality, that they all think, oh, surely, you just need to do this, or like you need to use this better turbulence model, or you need to do this surrogate model. And yeah, you realize that this is why I always say about foundation models or something, that the idea that you come in and you would use a method to come up with a brand new design from scratch, in reality, they already know what needs to be done, and it's tweaking the most fine things that is often is never usually tested. It's usually like a big thing, isn't it? Like the delta between this and this, and you're looking for the difference of, 2 drag counts or something. I've often find it quite humbling when you go in there thinking you can make a difference, and then you're like, oh, this is already pretty well optimized.
And also to see these people who have put in the time and effort and have the passion, and they have that special skill set. Like, I know how to squeeze out a delta here in these manipulations that sort of are, the way I almost think about it is, if we think about what AI is largely trained on, RMSE is sort of a blunt instrument. It's sort of I got all the big scale stuff for you, right? But the winning race car is about all the fine details and promoting these in a loss function somehow. This is interesting because you can see that neural networks act as bandpass filters. So essentially, like, I got the big stuff right, all the small stuff doesn't really contribute to that RMSE score. So like, whatever, we'll throw it out. Now, of course, we can make efforts to, put a diffusion model down there or something like this to try to like fill it in so it makes it look right. But this attention to small detail, which a human can make the focus, maybe we teach our neural networks to do this, but like in their general deployment, this is not really, these little micro adjustments are so fine detail, they don't score in the training score hardly at all.
Now that is where, though, I do think the agents I am far more bullish on, because I feel like, with the greatest respect to the Formula One engineers, what they're doing is still something that is just, you can describe what they do. And actually, I think if you look across the grid, my hypothesis of why is one team, 1 year amazing, and then another year it's not. And you're like, if they really understood everything that's needed to be done, surely they would just each year be able to do great. The fact that they take wrong turns, they go down the wrong direction, they have a very large optimization space that once you start going down a route, you can't really turn back, and you sort of have to go. And I do feel that it is still a very large optimization problem that a machine could ultimately do better than a human, in theory, with ultimate resources. But yeah.
So if I was somehow in charge of some version of some Formula One team, and sort of as a, let's say, call it I'm the AI director of some Formula One team. What I think I would be doing, and I'm also bullish on the agent piece of this, I would be setting up extensive interviews with all of my experienced engineers. Like, how are they making their decision? So you made this decision. Why? I want you to verbalize it. Why did you make the decision? What did you see in the data? Because a lot of the experiential learning that these, master engineers have, they have a pipeline. It's just they haven't maybe verbalized it. And if you could pull that out and you say, my agent's going to try to take on your persona, the way you think, but it needs to be trained in the way you think, the way you're making your decision points. I actually think that is a viable way forward, and that could accelerate things significantly. And so the downloading of experience of people is somehow some next step that needs to happen. And it could be that these people have never thought about deeply about what was my algorithm. If I had to, if I have to write down what I do and when I'm looking at the car, and because it's actually interesting when you look at McLaren, you walk up and down this pit of engineers, and then when you're down on the design aero side, you see basically people have the double screen like they do a very tough company, and what they've got pictures on there is flow physics, and these guys are just studying this all day long to make their decisions. But if you could understand, if they could verbalize what they're doing in that study, a machine could do it in just okay, I did it in 5 seconds. What you spent all morning looking at, here 5 seconds later, here's the assessment.
Yes.
And if you don't know what they're looking at, it's really hard for the agent to know that, right?
The only thing on that, and I don't want to go too down a rabbit hole on this one, but is if I was an experienced F1 engineer who's done it for 20 years, I'd almost want to, copyright my skills.md or something, or monetize it, because, as you could imagine, once that person's described their thought process and you put it into some skills file or whatever, and then the team goes, right, well, thank you very much. The agent actually now runs much faster than you can. So, see you later. I do often wonder, because I completely agree with you, this human knowledge can be extracted, because it is often quite repeatable. But I think it's an interesting, if someone's creating a startup of I'm going to monetize my knowledge and use me as an agent, but I need some money out of it. Because
so this is actually, I think this argument is one of the most amazing, I think, things we're going to have to deal with overall in the tech community. Even, here at Autodesk, there at McLaren, which is, okay, so if these agents are so effective and we can program them to be effective, if you're a Formula One team, do you say if I can do this, I could shrink my workforce? Or do you go the other ways? With my workforce, I can 10x the number of designs I'm doing, going through. This is a really interesting point for us. A company like here, you say well, hey, essentially one person can do now 10x the work they used to be able to. Well, guess what? We could take 10x customers.
Yeah.
Or we could cut the company down by 10. So
I suspect it will probably be more that you'll just be able to do more, with the staff that you have. I suspect so. That's my gut feeling, because whenever we've had more, your HPC facility can now run your cases twice as fast, or the code can run. Normally it's been that, okay, great, now you just have to do double the amount of work, or you do twice as many simulations, or you do whatever. But I definitely think that is an interesting one. The question for you on Autodesk, do you have any regrets you didn't go into industry earlier on? Now that you're there, is there any?
Actually, not so much. I mean, I actually, I think this was just a perfect time in life for me to come here at this point. But I think that, I mean, I guess in some sense I haven't been so money motivated overall career wise. I think obviously could have gone into a tech company in Seattle much earlier. Like you pick one, they're all there,
Yeah.
right? That wasn't. I was more interested in doing really interesting work if I could. Autodesk kind of, like I said, was a confluence of the right time intellectually. Like I said, I wanted to really think about how can I handle geometry and physics jointly? How does geometry induce physics, right? I was just so fascinated after that McLaren year that, so it was the right time intellectually for me to come to Autodesk. And I'm very happy with it now. But I don't regret my time at UW. I think that was what I learned there and the students I had. I loved my students and my postdocs and my collaborators. So it's just a good time in life. And also my kids graduated from high school, so I didn't have to think about trying to live in a good school district in London.
Yeah.
Me and my wife could just say, where do we want to live? And we don't have to worry about all this kid stuff, right? Which is, I went through that already. I'm done.
So where's the future lie then? Where do you see, if we could put a looking glass and we skip forward in 5 years and you and I talk again, hopefully somewhere like Barcelona or some nice location, where do you think we'll be?
Yeah. So the first thing that I think is going to happen sooner than later is people aren't going to put out GitHub code. They're going to put out GitHub agents. I'm just using that language. Right now you say hey, I wrote this code. You can download it on GitHub. It's no, you're just going to give me access to your agent that manages all of that. Right. So it feels to me like this agentic push is quite a real thing. Even programming on a higher level, with something like Kiln, just in terms of the workflow, instead of me starting to just run your code, I'm interacting with your agent with your code. I think that's one thing that is bound to happen. I maybe I'm wrong, but I kind of feel like that's right. That's just such a clean pathway for people to share code as you're sharing the agent. So it's not it's just like you're saying, here's my code and the grad student that wrote it. So if you have any questions, they can answer all of it because they built this code. That's the agentic part of that now. Second, I just feel like we're going to have this ability to deploy so many of these agents and partnerships that we're going to be able to come up with. I think we're going to have much bigger thoughts than we've had in the past, because in a lot of our future thinking, we don't just think, what if we did this? We also have to balance it but what could I actually maybe do if I stretch? But now what you could do if you stretch is it's so much bigger. So I think about our goal setting capabilities now in terms of and I think I'm still trying to get my head around that now, because I'm trying to also train myself to think much bigger thoughts about what we could achieve given the tools that have just even in 1 year have emerged. 1 year alone has all of a sudden gives you this transformational ability. And the hard part about making these projections into the future is that right now you don't know, if someone's going to all of a sudden pop something out in 1 month. By the way, here's this new tool. Check it out. And it's oh my gosh, changes everything, right? This is starting to happen even in design space. So I'll promote a paper that these guys wrote from sort of largely a Oxford, Cambridge collaboration called Art of Craft. Maybe you saw this one. This is just this generative design with articulated engineering products. And it's just this fascinating thing that they were able to build out. And you're okay, I didn't think this was This is incredible that they achieved it,
Mm,
right? And it just feels like, so what people are able to achieve
mm,
sometimes is beyond what like. Like, I'm not imagining big enough, frankly. Is
yeah.
I think that's the take home message for myself in this last year is like, I've got to be much more grand scoped in my imagination about what could be
Mm,
accomplished. Um, and it's also part of what I'm instilling with our team is like, we need to think a lot bigger
yes.
about things.
I would, I mean, that's been probably one of the things that I've enjoyed being at NVIDIA is it's a company that, obviously thanks to the guy at the top, Jensen,
Yeah.
tends to think quite big, and it is quite infectious. You do start to, now, of course, that's going to be based on that you can deliver it and it has to have some reality. But I think, thinking big is probably something that in some ways academia is good at doing, but I feel like to your earlier point, it's also one where we're quite quick to shut things down, especially the review process and the sort of, there is a little bit of a skepticism or, whereas probably the tech world is more willing to which is, I guess, why all startups come about. So I would tend to agree with you that thinking big is actually a requirement at the moment, given how fast things are moving.
Yeah, and also I think that academics used to have some of the bigger thought life, I guess I would say.
Mm.
And there's still some truth to that. But at least in our fields, it's not clear they have the resources now
Well, that's
to go
yes.
after it. Um, and this is partly the success, what I've seen of the computer science crowd is if you really look at some of the big pushes and some of the academics involved, is because they've been in partnerships with resource rich companies like Google, like Meta,
Mm. Yeah.
like NVIDIA, where it's like if they were just sitting at Stanford, like I have my friends there at AI Labs, one of my grad students is going to go there for a postdoc, and I'm super excited.
Mm.
It's like, it's like if you want to do something interesting there, it's pretty easy to reach out, and I think
Mm.
have these people partnering with you to do big scale work that like if you were
Yeah.
just there like me and you have to write a grant to get a little machine that like can only do a fraction of it, like, but now they can really work with in this environment to do great things. Um, so yeah, I think right now industry is favored in terms of transformational parts
Mm.
open because the resources are there to do things. I think the pressure on industry is to get the right partnerships with academic people, right? Uh,
Yes.
and vice versa. Like, so if you, I think that still is a really great strategy. Is that, even here at Autodesk, I have definitely am reaching out to people that I think are really valuable and making
Mm.
connections. Um, so I'm valuable to them now sitting on the industry
Yes.
side. They're valuable to me sitting on sort of the intellectual thought life side, but the partnership is fantastic because everybody really wins in it. Uh,
Yes.
and so that's I think a really important place to go forward too.
Yeah, no, I agree with you that probably should rephrase what I said before. It's true, academia can have big thoughts,
Yeah.
but because they know they don't have the resources, it's almost like, well, that's a nice thought, but I'm never going to be able to do it.
Yeah.
So what can I actually achieve and get a paper out and, get this funding in? So they then have to think smaller. Whereas you're right, if you're a big tech company, you can be a bit bolder.
Yeah.
So when the two come together, you get the best.
Yeah.
I guess. So maybe as a final question for you, we touched upon it a little bit. If we have, let's say, some students listening now,
Yeah.
whether they're undergraduates or PhDs, it's a tricky time, right?
Yeah.
Um, what would you recommend that they would focus, let's say, a PhD on?
Yeah.
Or what should they study to be relevant in the next sort of 5 years of this wave of transformation?
Yeah. So my first thing I tell them is uh, they're living, I think, in one of the most exciting times in human history. because I think this time, the future generations, they'll pinpoint this period of time as like the world changed. And this is massively influential about what it means for us as humanity right now. This is, and to be part of it. I mean, it doesn't mean it has a good ending, whatever. I'm just saying that but they are part of the puzzle piece in there. And not only so, it's fascinating. It's a little scary. They got to strap on their seatbelts and go, and just like this is going, and there's no stopping this thing. I mean, as much as people want to step back and say, let's wait, let's talk about it. It's like, there's too much inertia. We're going, and we just have to do this. But there's this famous quote from Picasso that I always like to share with people. It was from 1968, the year I was born. And Picasso in 1968 made a comment about computers. And his is his quote: "Computers are worthless. They can only answer questions." And I think that statement is amazing today, which is the real value, I think, is us as humans are still there asking the what ifs. You know, a lot of these startups come from people like, what if we could do this? What if we could do that? What if I want to go to the moon? I want to build an airplane. I want to build a Formula One car. How would I? So largely it feels like even with this AI kick, these are amazing new tools, but really you're still in charge of really directing where a lot of this goes. You're not a passenger, you're the driver. It's just that you now have a Lamborghini or a Ferrari, right? And you didn't get taught how to drive this thing. So that's what makes it a little scary. So that's one thing. The other is that I still think you need foundational knowledge. You still need to be as well educated as you can, and just really foundational thinking. Whether that's so the mathematics that underlies it, whether it's computational math, deep linear algebra knowledge, or deep physics knowledge. These things still matter a great deal because at some point they're going to play fundamental roles in largely developing your thought processes and your critical thinking ability, but also maybe bringing you back to foundational thinking when you're developing these models. And of course, for them, they just have to adopt these tools like Claude. If they're not using Claude Code or something like Kiln or Cursor, it's like every day you're getting further behind from where people are working, right? And it feels a little uncomfortable, right? Ultimately, for some of them, right? It's like, I'm getting this code. Should I read through it? Should I give me this 1,000 lines of code and it works, but I kind of just only have a vague idea of what each piece is doing. That feels very uncomfortable because, like, I'm sure when you were in school and when I was in school, it's like, you had to know every single line of your code. You wrote every single line of your code. And so it's such a transformation of, like, yes, you have to kind of know that. You have to know what's going on. But on the other hand, you'd like to figure out how to move at the speed of what's happening. So, like, and it's such two opposite poles that have to be there.
I did, I was having a conversation with one professor who mentioned something interesting. I won't say his name just in case he didn't want it to be shared, but although it's nothing controversial, it was just the point of how would you, if you're an undergraduate, saying you should use AI as a tutor, not to do it for you. So you should still do everything yourself, but essentially use AI to guide you. It's like they are unbelievably good at explaining things in any tone you want, in any adapt it, but you've got to do it yourself because if not, you won't learn it. But then as you transition into, let's say, a PhD, it starts to become more of an assistant. Where maybe you have learned some of the physics. So now you can rely on it more and you're just sort of checking it. And then as you get even more later in your career, you're almost using it as a PhD or as a junior engineer. And so I feel like the risk is if you use AI at the undergraduate level, like somebody does maybe in our situation, that's the danger because then you've not really learned it. But of course, the temptation is to use it when you're an undergraduate in that way. And that's probably the risk factor, isn't it? Like, do you ever really understand things when you have this cheat code? Essentially, it's like playing a computer game with the cheat code. It's hard not to use it sometimes.
Well, and I think that's a fair assessment of things, and I think ultimately, if I was still an academia and so forth, I think the thought really needs to be spent on how to use this tool is the high end students, your super smart students. You don't have to worry about them. They'll just figure it all out. They didn't need you in the first place. They can just figure stuff out. They'll learn it on their own. They'll have deep knowledge of stuff, and they're not a concern. The low end students have always been problematic because they never quite get it, no matter how much you try to, they're maybe not spending the time they need. It's that middle group who are going to be your day-to-day engineers in so many companies. How do you educate that group to be good stewards of the software, of the practices? Right, because I think that group needs probably the most guidance of how to be an intelligent engineer in a world where it is so tempting to just pawn it off here, right? It's easy, and I get the right hand, whatever. But how do you teach that group to use these things responsibly so that they are, because look, these are the people who build our airplanes and build our cars. We need them to be proficient and be responsible, right? Because we are going to be in their product space.
Yeah.
And I don't know what the right answer there is, except that we need them to know these tools. We need them to also balance it with but how do you check these tools and have maturity about using them? Because people depend upon you checking this, because I'm going to get in the car, you built me, and I don't want that thing falling apart when I'm going down the freeway, right?
Yeah, exactly. Great. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak. I'm sure we could have carried on for many hours, and I hope we can do that, but maybe over a drink sometime.
That sounds good to me.
But all the best at Autodesk. I'm very excited to see what your group's going to create, and I'm sure we'll hear about it over the coming years.
Awesome.
So, thank you again.
Great. You bet. Thanks, Neil.